you're telling me that you're a little stressed about what the reaction is going to be to an upcoming guest, Ann Coulter. And I'm a little surprised by that only because I'm not sure I fully understand who your audience is, because obviously I have an audience that's going to be upset by me sitting here with you. And members of my audience might think your guys' audiences are like largely coterminous and be surprised that your audience wouldn't be happy with that. So who do you think listens to you and why?
I'm not stressed particularly.
Okay.
I mean, I'm just anticipating a certain amount of blowback, but and everything you do, they hate. I mean, that's what you, and the people who, they're the ones that contact you too. I don't know who my audience is. I just don't. I mean, it's, it's 100,000 people get it, and almost like 18,500 people pay for it.
Well done.
So who, well, thanks, but who, I don't know who they, I burned off, because I started in 2000. So I got this big pro-war following, then I burned them off once I turned against the war. And then I got this big Obama following because then I supported Obama. And then, then that kind of collapsed, even though I was very anti-Trump. I don't know. I've just learned not to think about your audience too much and to ignore them. And I know it's so personal in many ways, and the things they say to you and about you, you'd be inhuman not to absorb some of it.
Yeah, because some of the critique, I would never want to become so siloed or so confident in my own takes that I was completely unreceptive to the feedback that I've gotten, right?
That's also true.
So, you're telling me like you have had these audience shifts over the course of kind of ideological shifts that you've had. I would argue for the better. I mean, I think going from pro-war to anti-war is a good thing. And to the extent that you have an audience that's mad about that, screw them. Right? Because you have obviously made a decision and you have grown and pivoted in a direction that I think is useful. There are other times when arguably we might be making different kinds of decisions where we should be open to our audience. And I wonder what you think of some of the contemporary criticism that you get these days. I'm sure you're not naive to what I think much of the left thinks about you, the reasons why you ultimately left, New York Magazine. What was that like? How did you assess whether or not to value that criticism and to what degree?
Well, we kind of institutionally value it by every week after my main column having the dissents of the week. So it's right there in front of the reader's eyes every week. And they're not Potemkin criticisms. I mean, they're really substantive criticisms, and overwhelmingly they're from the liberal left. I mean, that's where a lot of them come from. And so when you not just read them yourselves, but you have them put in public every week in front of you, you kind of air that out a little bit. So you're not, and you force yourself to respond to them, however difficult, however maddening they can sometimes be. And I think that helps break the tension a little bit. It's like, you don't have to subscribe to this thing,
Yeah.
But if you really have an issue with something I've written or said, have at it. I will try and respond. So all I'm really asking of you is the willingness to engage. I am not shutting down criticism. I'm inviting it actually and responding to it. And that, I think, is a lot of what the readers taught me in the Dish days, when they were much more immediately in my face all the time. And they also told me things I didn't know. For example, I mean, this is the classic one, but I made a post once about late-term abortion, about why I thought a rather dismissive tone, where I'm like, anybody could support that. And suddenly we got email after email from women who had late-term abortions that were extraordinary in their candor and overwhelmed me emotionally. And I realized, in a way that I wouldn't otherwise have realized, that these really awful things, they are awful. The mothers don't want that. The doctors don't want it. Something has emerged late in the pregnancy that almost always makes it medically an agonizing decision. This is horrible. And these mothers want these kids. Anyway, so I kind of I had to absorb that. And then I changed my mind and I said, I'm wrong. I will defend these. In fact, I think they're the most defensible in some ways. And so I think if you show you're able to do that within your own space, I think it helps siphon off some of the pressure, but it's still not enough for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, so for example, if the question on people's minds, I'm obviously here with author, journalist, podcaster Andrew Sullivan. The question that for my audience is going to be on a lot of their minds is why? What's the point? What's the point, Briahna, of sitting down and talking to someone like Andrew Sullivan, who is on an ideologically different space than I think most of my listeners? And part of the answer to that is I went on your show a few weeks ago, and I feel like we had a really interesting and productive dialogue. And the criticism I think that the left gets, and is sometimes true, is that there is an unwillingness to air certain kinds of conversations in a way that I think personally promotes siloing that prevents people from having the kind of evolution that you just described with respect to late-term abortions, for instance. And so I'm curious whether you have had any time to reflect on any of kind of the feedback or discourse that occurred around my appearance on your show a few weeks ago.
We had nothing but positive feedback. My readers were like, "God, thank God you got somebody on." The readers of me, I don't know. They think of me as sort of a rather recalcitrant child sometimes, and they're
Why do you say that?
Well, because a lot of them, the tone of a lot of it is, "Oh, stop it, Andrew! Like, you know, you're better than this. You're doing this, that, and the other. Stop it." And my view is, I actually believe this, and I'm not going to back down, and this is why. And so that's tend to the tone of it all. Mm. So they're kind of forgiving. Look, they don't have to be there. And I'm not imposing this on them. They're not having to read me because they subscribed to a magazine they weren't aware I was going to be in or something, you know? So I think it's important because I think it's in those conversations that you actually figure out areas of agreement. So, for example, I do think that on economics, as we discussed in that podcast, there's been an enormous shift leftward in the general culture and the general politics. Mm. I mean, there's some backsliding, obviously, and it's not
in terms of the discourse, I would say yes. There's a lot more openness and receptivity to left ideas. They're polling extremely well. Whether or not our either political party has been willing to really pick up the mantle in any of those policies in a meaningful way, I think is a little bit of a different story.
But the fact that so many Republicans, for example, are now talking about labor and working class wage. Now, whether they're doing it cynically or whatever. No, but they have moved. I mean, I think if you look at the positions of someone like Josh Hawley on economics, they're not Mitt Romney anymore. And that's interesting. Right?
It is. I think Hawley is still an outlier, but, and again, there is, I mean, this is a thing that we deal with on the left as well, which is, if you know that you are taking a minority position that's not going to get passed anyway, does that give you freedom to be more left or to be someone on the right who is more labor focused? You know, are you allowed to basically have an unorthodox opinion knowing that it's never going to get passed and the party will kind of let you throw your little tantrum, throw your little fit in the corner? And at what point is it all kind of a gamesmanship, right? Because the left right now is engaged in this conversation about the reconciliation bill. And to what extent people that the left was really excited about, the squad members, these progressives in Congress who were going to fight harder than corporate Democrats historically have, were they going to hold the line and basically hold up the bipartisan infrastructure bill to make sure that the human infrastructure bill had the good stuff in it? Now, what seems to have happened is they've neutered the human infrastructure bill to an extent that they can say, we held the line and we're going to vote for both. It'll be both. But it's like, voting for an empty balloon. I mean, that's perhaps an overstatement, but compared to the $6 trillion plan or the $3.5 trillion plan, a lot of really meaningful, very popular stuff is getting cut. And so at what point is it all a kind of a theater? And how much are these lefties legitimately lefty? I just saw an article that says the DSA is kicking Jamal Bowman out of, or they're trying to
really
retract, yes, because of a number of votes that he's taken and not being ideologically aligned sufficiently. So where are we really?
We're in a place where was pretty clear we were in last January, which is that the Democrats only control the Senate by a total fluke, really, in Georgia. Just 2 seats they almost certainly would not have won under normal circumstances.
If there hadn't been COVID, if Trump hadn't been...
If ex-president had not gone out there and said, don't vote if you're a Republican, those kind of small issues.
Sure.
And they lost ground in the House. Mm-hmm. And the most sort of, at least to most normie voters, the most moderate Democrat won the primary. Mm-hmm. And then they launched the most ambitious left agenda imaginable. Well, and then they're surprised that it didn't actually get through.
What do you mean the most ambitious left agenda?
$3.5 trillion of investing in every social spending program you can think of.
Well, I assure you that the left can think of a lot more social spending programs that were in that bill.
$3.5 trillion. Look, you can't have spent the first part of this year saying this is the most ambitious step forward since LBJ.
I didn't say any of that. So
okay, not you, but that was said. It wasn't
liberals.
Like the Democrats did not claim it was a radical, huge new shift on top of the trillions of dollars we spent on COVID, and then the huge amount of money on real infrastructure. Bill, if you pardon.
No, I don't know what else to call it. Roads and bridges, traditional infrastructure.
Yes. So I just think, a little bit of realism about this when you're on a knife edge.
So I want to clear.
When you were elected really to not to be Trump and to get back to normalcy. And then you suddenly turn around and say, well, okay, guys, now we want the biggest spending package ever. And we're going to shift the way everything is taught and understood in your schools and blah, 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 blah. And we all think this is great. And suddenly it's not. And you don't have the support for it in the Congress. And maybe if you just said, okay, let's just take 2 very popular elements in the BBB thing, just focus on those, sell those. That's what Trump, he sold everything to the nth degree. Instead, you don't sell anything, really. You're not out there selling the benefits of these things. You're talking to each other. Nothing seems to be happening. Then you seem to have gotten something with infrastructure, and then you're not, and it's held up. People just think, what are you doing?
So on that rhetorical point of focusing on selling some big ticket items, especially given that the bill got neutered in the way that it did, we're getting a bunch more things for a shorter period of time in a way that isn't permanent, in a way that I think is going to have bad downstream political effects. Now, especially in retrospect, I do think it would have been better to focus on whatever your key agenda items were, especially given that a handful of them are so enormously popular. Prescription drug negotiation with 80% of Americans, including Republican majorities, supporting it, and child care, enormously popular. People have been getting those checks. They love it. They want to keep it.
That's enough, by the way. You got those 2 things? You got enough to sell.
Unfortunately, it's not quite enough because we also have a climate crisis. Right. And that getting stripped from the bill is perhaps the biggest untold story, under-explained story. It hasn't
quite been stripped, though, as I understand it.
So what ended up happening is, and there has been a lot of myth-making, I would argue, by leftists about this who have tried to paper over the reality. There was $150 billion in climate in the human infrastructure bill. That was meaningful climate spending and was focused on not just so basically that meaningful spending got converted into $150 billion in basically tax subsidies for electric vehicles and the kind of interventions that basically are tax cuts for industry who are in the electric space, but not anything geared toward actually cutting carbon emissions, right? So obviously in a corporate landscape, industry is going to be a lot more sympathetic to money being spent to pay them to develop technology than it is to actually curb the behaviors that are warming the planet. And so even progressives, I saw Ro Khanna recently, who we had on the show, and we talked about this a little bit, but recently go on TV and when asked about the cuts to the climate, he basically said, okay, yeah, we lost that $150 billion, but we got this other $150 billion. And there has been an attempt, I think, to obscure the extent to which these are very differently allocated types of money that have very different real world effects in terms of our ability to survive this climate apocalypse. But if I can, I want to take us back just a little bit, because this is something that came up in the context of when I came on your show that we didn't really have a time to unpack. And that is this difference between lefts, what I would call the left, what I would call liberals, and what I would call conservatives broadly from right-wingers to more moderate conservatives, right? And I do think that sometimes when we're talking, I'm a leftist.
No.
Right. But when I say I'm a leftist, I think sometimes I hear you say things like, the left said that Biden was the greatest president, was going to be the next FDR, and had all these huge spending proposals and stuff. I recoil at that because I wasn't saying that. None of us were saying that. We on the left, progressives, leftists, socialists, whatever you want to call us, we perceived that narrative project as being implemented by corporate Dems and a corporate media infrastructure to give cover to Biden, who is not and who has never been radical in any respect. They were trying to sell Biden to a country, a broad left that I think does have an appetite for more progressive politics, and was trying to whitewash his record preemptively. And so to point to that fake narrative as evidence that Biden somehow alienated a base or was being more to the left of what the country would tolerate, I think is inaccurate. I think if anything, I think you're correct that he did a bad job of selling these programs, of creating early momentum for these programs, of trying to pass them earlier in the year when he had more of a mandate, of attaching some of these interventions to the must-pass bill, COVID bill in March. When he actually did have leverage, because that was a bill that needed to pass in order to keep the economy going, that even corporatists were behind because they needed that bailout money as well. But I think it's important as we get into some of these conversations to be clear, Biden doing something, Hillary Clinton supporting something, those are not indicators that the left is also going to be on board. You're never going to be able to impeach me, but Biden said, or Hillary thinks, or Obama likes, because I don't care about any of them. Those are not my people. Those are not the left's people.
Okay. Well, I don't want to misattribute different factions on the left like different factions on the right. I have a lot of respect for the economic left at this point, because I think they've been right about a couple of things, quite obviously, over the last 30 years.
Like what?
I do think that the massive amount of profit that has come from these vast technological changes has accrued to a minuscule number of people in ways that we probably couldn't have anticipated quite the way it happened.
Yeah.
And I think a sane conservatism would have adjusted for that sooner. And there was a sort of brain dead zombie Reaganomics that carried on that was, I think, wrong. I mean, I have a long record against it, but I'm in more of the pragmatic mode in terms of conservatism. And I don't think these things as principles that are held forever in stone, that you never raise taxes, for example. Of course, you have a war, you have to raise taxes. I'm sorry. I'm still one of these people that actually believe that you just can't print money endlessly and keep and never have a day of some kind of fiscal reckoning.
Any instance other than war? What if there were an economic crisis caused by global pandemic?
That would be the other thing that you would spend.
Or what
I
if
supported the Obama stimulus from the get-go. And yes, I do think that's true. On the other hand, I do not think when you're in periods of really quite remarkable economic growth that you cut taxes. I mean, the Trump years were insane. Yeah. Of course you should have cut taxes. You should have raised them at that point.
Well, what do you make about this billionaire tax? I mean, one of the funding propositions was a tax on what would only be about the 700 richest Americans. And that got shut down by Kristen Sinema on the basis of queens are going to queen. She's going to live her best life.
Politically, that's a brilliant thing to do. Politically, it's
to tax the rich.
Yeah, well, and especially I'm just talking now in terms of selling it. Mm-hmm. Yes, we're going to tax the 700 richest assholes in the world in order to give you
just in the country.
Child tax credit.
Yeah.
I don't know why you guys can't make this kind of crude argument. Okay, I don't want to include you, but I'm looking from the outside. I am aware of Democratic splits, but I'm not analyzing this. I'm reading the paper every day.
How do you identify politically? When you say you're looking from the outside, what position are you in?
I think I'm an independent. I mean, I'm registered independent.
I'm also an independent.
Right.
But Bernie was an independent.
I've supported various people over the years, depending on what I think the circumstances of the country.
But on a kind of a left conservative spectrum, where do you see yourself fall, or who do you consider to be kind of your political ideologues or your political bedfellows?
Well, I am curious about the Tories in Britain, probably not completely.
I thought we're American now.
Well, we are, but the political models in the UK and the US have often been in sync. And you, for example, you had Reagan Thatcher, you had Blair Clinton. You can see these shifts. And what you've had in Britain is a kind of interesting test case of if Trumpism, in the sense of, and again, we have to be careful here, in a sense of culturally small c conservative, not religious right, but just that we don't want to rock the boat too much conservative, plus anti-illegal immigration, cutting on immigration, plus a reinvestment in neglected working class communities and more spending on healthcare. That's an interesting combo. And for it to be so successful, it strikes me as an interesting experiment. That's why I've got Dominic coming on the podcast soon. He's the guru of Brexit. And so I think there are other elements. I mean, I would have voted for Youngkin, absolutely, in Virginia, for example. I'm prepared to accept a sort of slightly more socially conservative, anti-woke, multiracial right-wing coalition. That's where I become. Now, whether that happens, whether that's an option for me, I don't know. But what Biden has presided over is not winning me over at this point.
So we at some point should talk about CRT and what happened in Virginia, since that's hot on everybody's minds right now. But I'm curious, as a gay man, whether or not that gives you any pause, considering whether or not how tolerant you would be of a certain amount of cultural conservatism, even if it came with some other social goods. Now, to be clear, in America, we don't have a package like that. We don't have any kind of version of Republican Party that cares about expanding healthcare access and all the other these good populist politics plus social conservatism. That's a mix that doesn't exist.
I tell you, if they do get close to that, it's going to be quite successful.
It would be dangerous. It would challenge even someone like me.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes when I have my own critique of identity politics, the question that gets raised is, what's the best way to help my community? Is it through some of these culture wars, or is it through some of these kind of identity-focused policies that are often limited in scope and serve to help Black elites like myself, to be honest? Or is it through some universalist policies that are really poverty-focused and really help pull up the neediest people in the country? And if I believe the answer is the latter, if I have to choose. And if the answer is the latter, and that we're coupled with a certain kind of small c conservatism, it would really challenge, am I going to pout about someone not using language that I would like and let people die in the streets of hunger and starvation? That just doesn't seem like an ethical choice.
It doesn't seem to me either.
Now, I would love it if we didn't have to choose between those things and there was a party that did both. But I'm curious about this question of, do you ever feel like your own civil rights and liberties would have been could potentially be implicated in that kind of a trade-off? And does it give you pause?
Well, it shouldn't be about my civil rights or...
No?
No.
As a voter, you shouldn't be concerned about whether your own interests are protected?
No, I think you should be interested in whether the policies that are being put forward are good for everyone, including yourself.
Including yourself,
okay, but that doesn't mean that you're demanding every single jot and tittle. You understand that there is a give and take in politics. But look, the gay rights movement is basically everything that's that important.
Yeah, but it wasn't that case 10 years ago.
No, it wasn't. But the difference is that we have built popular majorities behind those decisions in such a way that even the Republicans aren't bringing them up again. I mean, they found out that Youngkin did not personally favor marriage equality, but there was no question of him wanting to elect justices who would reverse it or campaign on those issues. It's more about now things like the trans stuff in schools that is generating that kind of heat. Now, do I identify with the trans people? Absolutely, I do. Do I think that there's been some overplaying of certain ideas? Yes, I do. And I think we should come back a little bit on that front. But I'm at this point, on the social conservatism front, I think the social conservative right have lost so thoroughly everywhere that I'm not afraid that somehow they're going to come back and put me in jail or something.
Is there any dissonance for you in saying the social conservatives have lost and also this narrative that's emerging that says that Youngkin won in Virginia because he managed to make the whole race about CRT, which is obviously not LGBT issues, but it is another kind of culture war that was very artificially created by this guy, right? This is not, they're being very open about it. Like, this is not.
The fact that Chris Rufo brags on Twitter,
correct,
like any social activist would if they've won a few victories, does not mean to say it's mutually exclusively. It's not, the truth is not mutually exclusive of a scenario in which there are actually still some real issues here,
right? But the idea that
need
this
to
was
be addressed, and that the school issue seems to have, and again, we'll figure this out better as we look through the results and think this through more. But the schools issue seems to have been connected in people's heads with the pandemic. So they hadn't gotten their kids in schools for a long, long time.
There's anxiety about them not having learned the meat and potatoes of school, which is exacerbated by the idea that they're learning quote unquote woke stuff that parents don't see as valuable.
And they see things like the San Francisco school district, like clearly putting woke symbolism above learning and writing and reading and that stuff. And
How do you mean?
Well, they were renaming their schools and having all these
But when you say putting above writing and reading,
well, they
was there
weren't
some
teaching
evidence
any
that
kids
it was?
at that point. There were no kids who were in the schools, but the school board meeting was talking about renaming it after a non-white supremacist. Or whatever.
Wait. So is the argument that when school was out of session, that was a bad time to have a conversation about some of these other issues?
It was not where parents' anxieties were, put it that way. There was no pent-up demand to rename every school, as opposed to a pent-up demand to get the kids back and get them learning.
Drill down, because part of the argument that's been made that I think is more sympathetic, and therefore I want to make sure that if it's not true, I want to give air to it, is that people are prioritizing CRT, whatever that's supposed to mean, over kind of the meat and potatoes of book learning. And so to me, like, even if I like CRT, as a parent, I might say, okay, but I need my kid to learn the basics first. And making it an argument about which one is prioritized instead of just a flat argument about whether CRT should be taught almost abstracts away from the question of whether or not you are pro or against CRT.
Yes, it does.
And makes a more sympathetic argument that maybe is warranted.
I was at that point just trying to be analytic about what had gone on, as opposed to normative in terms of I think it's a terrible thing to be in schools, especially when you're teaching history. But I think it's even more terrible when you're teaching biology, when you're teaching mathematics, when the entire
CRT?
Yes, when the
What's
entire
the CRT version of mathematics and biology?
Well, that they are both products of white supremacist culture, created and sustained by white men, and that learning them traditionally is a form of oppression of non-white. Well, it's in every single critical race theory pamphlet and guide you want to read. It's something that was given to every school district in Virginia to actually understand the principles of critical race theory, and that's what it is.
I can pull it up if we need to. But what specifically was handed out in Virginia that you found objectionable?
Let's just understand what critical race theory is to begin with, right? It is the belief that the individual is less important than the group identity to which that individual.
It's not. People may or may not in some places believe that's true and teach that, but that's fundamentally just not what CRT is.
It absolutely is. It's integral to it. Mm-hmm. Well, how would you describe its relationship with the individual? What notion of the individual human being is there in critical race theory?
Plenty. I mean, in fact, the whole purpose of CRT is to try, and a lot of racial theory, critical race theory, like CRT, is the understanding that human beings are not allowed to be individuals. I think we all want to be able to be individuals and judged individually, but for there being certain societal structures that prevent people from living their lives and manifesting that individuality. So one of the things CRT evolved out of critical legal studies, as I'm sure you're aware. And critical legal studies was a group of scholars who were looking at the ways that our legal system, right, which is not natural, it didn't just come down from the heavens, like it was designed by people, flawed, fallible people, the ways in which it was designed to basically protect the interests of the people who designed it. Right. So obviously in America, because of historical reasons and not because of any intrinsic fault of white men, It happens to be the case that our legal systems protect power and affluence and money that's disproportionately white men, but that's kind of just besides the point. And so you learn about things in the law like, why are you shaking your head?
Because I think this is a whitewashing of what it actually
No,
teaches.
this is very much literally what I am a lawyer, and I there wasn't emphasized in law school really, but there was some passing references to it. And when this debate emerged last year, I took it to myself to read Derek Bell, and I have read some foundational text on what CRT is.
I have a PhD in political theory.
All right, so we're on this. We're two experts here putting our heads together on CRT.
It's not like I'm just making this out of my head. I know where this is coming from.
Here's what it says. It says things like, for example, here's an example of something that CRT would examine. Why is it that on the first day of corporate law, typically, you come into class and your corporate law professor says, what is the most important constituency that the law is here to protect? And the correct answer is the shareholder. The whole premise of corporate law is shareholder primacy. Every law is designed to make sure that it protects the shareholder interest. And when you're deciding in court whether someone has liability, you do so by assessing whether or not the decisions being made by the business people ultimately, it's like the business judgment rule. Would a reasonable person have made this decision to protect the shareholder, right? And that might seem like, okay, fine, that makes sense. It's just a decision. It's a neutral decision. But obviously, I think the two of us sitting here could think, well, are there other constituencies that the law should take into account if we want to have a society that thrives and is socially beneficial? So, for example, the environment.
But liberalism essentially is the defense of the individual's freedom to make a contract with any other individual.
Right.
And to have that enforced regardless of the identity of the people
involved. That's a decision. You say liberalism is about...
It's a position. It's definitely a position that if you take it away, you take away the very foundation of liberal constitutional democracy.
No. You can decide as a society whether you want to structure your society around protecting shareholders, protecting business interests, or you can decide as a society you want to protect other kinds of individuals, whether you want to protect children, whether you want to protect the basic rights of homeless people, whether you want to protect environmental interests that can't come into court.
On what you can contract to do if it affects other people. Yes, but the point of CRT is this. The individual is really just a product of the group, as you yourself kind of put it in a way.
How did I say?
Hold on, let me.
Okay.
Unpack that a little bit, which is that, as you put it, these social forces prevent people from being individuals. I think that's sort of roughly how you put it. Well, I don't believe that. I just don't believe it. I think that individuality is given before these structures and this society, which is why CRT is rooted in a structural systemic analysis of society, which is rooted in Marxism, which is a philosophy that is incompatible with democratic liberalism in the West. Now, if you want to change the whole system...
democratic liberalism, and why is it that it should be protected
because it
over someone's, let's say, individual rights or the environment or any other kind of thing?
There are limits on it, obviously, which we do have but it's the core basis.
Why? That's not a gotcha question. I'm
because
just
the individual, because this system of government was set up to protect individuals from the state.
Was it?
Yes.
Is that how America was set up?
Yes. Those are the ideas.
My recollection is a little bit different.
Core part of the Enlightenment, and that's how it turned out to be the most phenomenally successful way to structure society in human history, and expanded human freedom in ways that are quite overwhelming.
That those ideas, as much as we all have been inculcated with them as Americans and like them in the abstract, have not at any point in American history been truly fulfilled.
I disagree.
So you're talking about a country that you said are founded on these ideals where very open, this is not like conjecture or CRT, open records of the founding fathers and others ruminating on how to structure the society, openly debated the problems of having individuals have too much control and having a raw democracy. And so we have a bicameral government that's specifically designed so that it's not one person, one vote, so that you can give disproportionate power to less populous states, because there were concerns. People with lower populations, these big Western territories, they like, how are we going to have any power? And there was also some concern that what is the quote about if the masses are in control, it's
not designed to be
Right.
a majoritarian democracy, period.
Correct.
Of course, it's the 1780s.
And
Briahna.
there were particular rights
it didn't exist anywhere.
Right, but only landowners could vote.
It's true everywhere. The amazing thing in the 70s, 80s
when you say it's
is
true,
is that landowners could vote and have control over their government in a way they couldn't in Britain.
When you say it's true everywhere, is that a value statement? Do you think it was okay? It was a positive thing that only landowners could vote?
No, but we judge a time and an experiment, but in the context of its own time.
I'm not interested in judging, but I'm just saying.
No, I'm just saying in the context, it's quite clear the American Revolution and the principles it espoused were radically emancipatory and revolutionary ideas that were designed to take down a traditional monarchy.
Every argument can't be, it was better than what existed, therefore we can't be critical about how it was.
Of course we can be critical, but
so can I just stay in this critical space for 1 second?
Baby out with the bathwater.
Who's throwing anything out? Did I try to burn America down tomorrow? I am an American. Okay. So what I'm arguing, the point that I'm trying to make is that you're arguing against structural limitations that have always existed in our system. When we all just acknowledged and admitted that at the country's founding with all of these enlightened ideals, only landowners could vote. Now, don't you think that creates some downstream structural effects for who has power in the country if only some people are even allowed to participate in democracy?
The downstream cultural effects.
Not cultural effects, real world, economic, on the ground effects.
Yes.
Okay. So can we sit in that just for 1 second?
Sure. Let's
just sit in that. So the fact that only landowners could vote for much of the early American history, we're not even talking about race, because there are a lot of not the white landowners
on earth.
Right, but Andrew,
apart from the beginnings in England, but even there, not fully developed.
That is a logical
could anyone
fallacy.
Vote?
It is a logical fallacy to say that there cannot be structural winners and losers, that there cannot be problems with the system just because a system is better as compared to another system. So that is just, it doesn't get us anywhere.
But what made it better, is my argument, is that it rooted itself in the individual and protecting that individual's property. But it didn't root itself in an individual. Individual property from government power and from any other major conglomerations of power. It sought to divide up sources of power to make sure that no one had too much power. Now that again, in the context of the time, extraordinarily revolutionary. In the context of the time, obviously what you would call progressive. That's certainly what most of the people who signed this would say.
I would not.
Well, I'm just saying you can't apply 21st century standards.
But this isn't applying a 21st century standard, because there were plenty of people in the 17th,
including women,
18th
right?
century,
Women as well,
who very much disagreed with this, who were white men who didn't own land, who ultimately agitated for and successfully achieved the right to vote.
Yes.
Before women, we're not talking about women, we're talking about black people. Let's stay in the realm of white men.
My point is simply this: the right to vote that they got eventually, everyone got, and then women and all the rest of it. I mean, you see this in every major Western democracy, slowly. The greater inclusion was based upon the original right to vote of the landowner.
Right.
And without, that's what you're missing. And if you don't see that that's fueled by an idea of an individual marshalling his or her own future for him or herself, which was a revolutionary time, and that has led to America. And now you want to remove that basic unit of the individual from the entire thing. Well, that's what CRT really does want to do.
What I do want is for us to take the idea that we should have a representative democracy and that people who live in a community should be able to have control, a vote, a say in how their community is structured, and take that idea and reject the idea that it should at all be tied to their property rights, and to acknowledge that that is a gross distortion of democracy instead of papering over it as some laudable step toward goodness. Why can't we say the idea of democracy is obviously good and no one's trying to throw that out?
I don't think it is. I think liberal democracy
the abstracting out democracy to land owning people had nothing to do with any Enlightenment idea. It had everything to do with land owning people in power wanting to preserve that power for themselves. And that created real structural consequences for everybody who did not already own land, and replicated those inequities over time, and not even mentioning the people who had no promise of owning land in this country up until the 20th century legally, right? So You're nodding, so you recognize that people didn't have...
It evolved from this extraordinary idea that started in the 18th century that grew and evolved and was joined in by other groups, so that there was a slow, much more inclusive liberal democratic system in most of the Western countries.
So what were the consequences?
Which was great because it's still rooted in the individual, but now it's the individual regardless, or it should be regardless of some identifying characteristic like race or
Let's follow this thread. So you nodded when I said that there are people who didn't get the right to own property legally, de jure or de facto, up until
women, for example,
up until the 20th century and through much of the 20th century. But let's just. We don't have to have a conversation about the edges, but most of American history,
though, of greater inclusion.
Sure, but throughout most of American history, many groups were not legally allowed to own property.
As everywhere else on Earth.
Right. We're talking about America. So what were the consequences of that for those groups in America?
Eventually, the fundamental context is the construction of a system of government which avoids tyranny, oppression in that crude old sense. Now that's
fine, but that's not the question.
And religious freedom, and the freedom for them to eventually gain property and gain the rights of the old landowners, so that they were of a peer with the old landowners. This is the process. Now it's an imperfect process. It took time, but my point is that it isn't simply self-interest of landowners to believe in a Hobbesian, then Lockean, then Montesquieu version of democratic liberalism. It isn't. They had plenty of lands. This was giving them, and anybody for that matter, who could get that property, who could mix the labor with the land, rights against the government that could not be forsworn. Now, I would make the argument that that is the breakthrough, and that everyone else has slowly folded into that. And I agree that's regrettable, but I'm glad we've done that. But it was really about recognizing others' humanity, full humanity, as we did that, which I think in human history has been rare, but I think we've made great strides in this particular culture. I don't know of any other civilization that has managed to make those strides.
So I'm going to ask again, what were the consequences for the people that had to wait longer than others to access all of those full, wonderful Hobbesian, Lockean rights and goodness? What were the real world economic and social consequences for all of the people in this country who were not able to start accruing wealth and owning land until the 20th century?
They were intense, and no one's denying that. No. For example, I could not have, if I had gotten sick with AIDS, I would not have had the right to have my husband at my bedside, right? As recently as my adult lifetime, right? So I trust me, I am fully aware, and I fought very hard for those rights to be more inclusive. But I didn't want to get rid of the rights.
And I don't want to get rid of the rights either. So I'm not really sure why you keep bringing that up. Who are you arguing with?
Because this is sort of something I'm trying to.
Okay, let's get to this.
Philosophically, what comes first is power structures, and that's what you have to affect: power structures. And then think of the alternative, which is what matters above all is the individual, regardless of the power structures. They are two very incompatible, diametrically opposed views of the world. One will give you a liberal democracy, one won't. You can't somehow graft that onto that and think it's going to work. It isn't. It's going to constantly undermine itself.
I think part of the problem is...
This is why they say they want to dismantle the society rather than build it.
Well, if you notice when I'm speaking, Andrew, I'm not saying power structure, liberal democracy. I'm not speaking in any of those terms. Honestly, I don't understand what any of it means. I'll play the rube. I don't understand what any of those words mean. I'm trying to be very specific because I think that sometimes people can get lost in those terms. And we'll end up talking past each other because we're using those terms. Here's a very basic thing that I'm saying. I'm not making any arguments about systemic anything. Here's my understanding of the world, which sounds like it's your understanding of the world too. There were laws. Law is a structure. I don't know. I will say structure because it's literally an institutional structure.
What isn't a structure? That's what I'm interested in.
Well, that's fine. But I feel like most people would agree, even if they don't believe in systemic racism or systemic anything, that law, it's literally a system. We have a system of laws. They're written down. We've decided, not we. Again, there's a conversation about who writes the laws, but there's a system of laws that benefits its authors.
Well, again, if you wanted to say because someone did it, it's obviously biased towards them.
No, not because.
We could just go around in circles. But
well, not because. But this is CRT. Wait, Andrew.
Not.
Wait a minute. This is literally CRT. CRT is the study of the ways that the systems that appear to be neutral and that we all are taught are neutral and learn as neutral, in fact, are not, and not because anybody's secretly. There's scads of research and scholarship and historiography that demonstrates that they're not.
Is what you're talking about.
No,
right?
I'm really not. So
how do you prove that a law that is facially neutral isn't?
Something like Citizens United? Every law claims to be facially neutral.
Well, it is facially neutral. It doesn't single out particular groups that aren't allowed to.
Let's talk about this word facially neutral, because that's a big problem in the law.
It's basic to liberalism.
Well, a big problem in the law is that if you can, and I know this is going to be another point of contention, but that if you can design
I've studied it. I don't believe in it. I think it's a false view of the world, and that's a genuine
You know what? I've never read
disagreement.
Marx, so I can't. Let's just not use those terms, because I don't define things in those terms. I'm a big dumb. I know the people on the left are going to be mad at me for saying that.
When the early critical race theorists in their first volume say in their introduction, this is all down to Marx, I think you should take them seriously.
What I've heard about the guy is that he's pretty great, but I don't think that we need to talk about him to specifically to have this conversation, because I think a lot of the ideas that, as I understand them, that are from Marx are pretty intuitive. And that is why the ideology has found so much purchase, including in recent years. And we can get into that if you want to. But I would prefer at this point, I think, just to stay away from it, because I think it's not going to be clarifying. Well, not because I'm trying to avoid anything.
It's sort of the heart of the matter, but sure.
Well, but we can talk about the ideas without saying Marx, because there are a lot of people. I think it's clearer just to say what we mean.
Let me look at I'm just trying to think of how I always think about this. Like, I'm a Catholic, and it was a Catholic in England. So I grew up in a country. Now, Catholics weren't allowed to be in the parliament until the late 19th century. Huge amounts of cultural hostility towards them. The entire national story is really from the 16th century onwards, how Catholics are the Muslims they're the terrorists. And so that's the country I grew up in. Mm-hmm. And it clearly is there in the past. I didn't feel it affected me I was a little bolshy as a Catholic, and I was a little prickly about it, and I wasn't going to take any shit, but I didn't feel that the structures made it impossible for me to succeed because I was a Catholic.
I don't think that anyone is arguing that it's impossible to succeed as a Black person or a Latino person or as a gay person or anything in America either. It's obviously not impossible. We're sitting here having this conversation. I've had a pretty Tony life. So again, I want to resist some, I think, overly broad statements that can create unintentional straw men, because I don't think that that's what you're trying to do.
No, I'm just trying to actually clarify by getting down to very philosophical principles, because I do think that's where I'm coming from anyway, because that's what I've studied. That's what I sort of know. And
I hear that, but I would also say that reasoning from personal analogy in that way isn't necessarily the best way to identify, because what I have read, and I wish I had a computer in front of me, and you don't have to take my word for this, but I have read about the ways that even in kind of like more racially homogenous countries like England, that certain, you can trace like names and things like identity to religious groups to not zip codes, whatever you call them, I don't know, but geographic areas in the country that still map on to the patterns of discrimination or the marginalized status of various groups over time. And it's not just an American phenomenon. It's not just a racial phenomenon, but that especially in England, that has this more deeply entrenched kind of class structure where upward mobility doesn't have the same kind of stereotypical accessibility as it does in America, but absolutely historical marginalization has played out. So it might mean that you're sitting here as a successful person today. I'm sitting here as a successful person today, relatively in the grand scheme of things. But it is also true that someone who's similarly situated as me, who's gone to the same colleges and universities and has the same opportunity, still has a different life trajectory because our parents lived in very different worlds. My mother was never going to inherit anything in property or anything because my grandparents couldn't own any. And to the extent that they were allowed to buy, ultimately was in bad neighborhoods where the houses were immediately devalued by the fact that a Black person moved in. And when a Black person lives in a house, the property value of it automatically goes down. And that has accrued in terms of financial deficits over time. This isn't about my ability to achieve regardless. This isn't a condemnation of America. And it might be true that I have better outcomes here than I would in another part of the world. That also doesn't make it the case that we shouldn't be trying to interrogate how to make this country better, because I think that is sincerely what patriotism should be about.
If you were in front of me offering a concrete, practical plan to feasibly and practically erase the black-white wealth gap, I'd be all ears.
I've got a couple.
I've
got some ideas, Andrew.
But I would say it's very hard to pull that off.
It is hard.
And what I would say is that the very things that you say that many African Americans have achieved actually in this country, and I think there's an irony here that no one talks about African American success anymore because it's against both Donald Trump's interests and the woke left's interests. And if you look, for example, at how black women are gaining strength, I want this system which allows maximal freedom, which talks about the individual, irrespective of his or her identity, to thrive and pursue happiness as they see fit, to be something to be extended as much as we possibly can to anybody and remove any formal obstacle to their inclusion. Do I want to make sure, have a society organized around the fact that these outcomes have to be equivalent or identical, or that we have to understand these structural things as the primary force that we have to reorder before anything else can happen? Then I'm going to say no.
Well, I don't think that outcomes...
I don't know how you even get to some sort of agreement on that. Look, if you guys can have total racial and cultural warfare all the time.
No,
one group will want this, another group will want that. The individualism, regardless of these things, is what will make
Don't talk
sense.
me out of agreement, because I'm already with you. I do not believe that... I think that and many people on the left, including Adolph Reed, have talked about the equality of outcomes not being a good metric, have had a ample, robust criticism of disparity discourse, where disparities are focused on disproportionately and perceived to be necessarily evidence of something that they aren't always already. And I think that if you skip over the liberals and come over to the left, you'll see there's a lot of validation of that worldview. However, I'm also in agreement with the first part of that sentence that you said, which was that you want to get rid of all of the structural barriers that persist so that people can maximize their individual ability. Now, you and I might disagree on what and to what extent structural barriers still persist. And I'm heartened by this earlier conversation we were having. There's an acknowledgement. Okay, obviously, if only landowning people can vote, that was a structural barrier. Okay, obviously, if Black people and Asian people and other folks weren't able to buy property,
it wasn't a structural barrier. It was illegal. You were not allowed legally. That's different. No. Because what CRT was about was that we have this equal opportunity. We have these equal, but we're still not seeing progress. That was the question they asked themselves. So then they had to say, well, the answer is because structural things have to be there. Well, what if that's not the case? What if we just needed more time? What if, in fact, we didn't have to rig the system in advance for minorities so that they succeed? What if we just needed, in fact, not to send signals to minorities? They don't have to do the work that everyone else has ever done to get ahead. And maybe that was the wrong signal. Maybe, in fact, they're making up for their own failures by coming up with these structures and things that are somehow operating in ways that do not seem to operate for other groups and that are completely deterministic about the fate of society. Look, the leading advocate of all this, Ibram X. Kendi, couldn't be cruder, right? Could not be cruder.
We're no great defenders of Ibrahim X. Kendi on this show.
So much. Thank you. But why don't you speak out against him and the crudeness and reductionism?
He's not my priority. And
he should be, because he's preventing you from putting forward the economic ideas that would actually be popular.
To some extent. And when we encounter those kind of barriers, I mean, like, this is a large part of what I just end up talking about with
it shouldn't be
Thomas
up to
Jefferson
me
Williams
to criticize the early. I'm not. It should be you. I want to see these.
Well, no. Well, my priority is political and legislators. So my advice to legislators is to stop engaging in conversations about CRT and Ibram X. Kendi, because I don't think it's politically viable.
Can you stop them imposing it on school systems? Can you stop them imposing it on the teachers' unions? Can you stop imposing it in the very language of the New York Times?
I think that CRT is actually good, but I don't think that CRT is what it actually is being taught in schools. And I also, because it's an elite graduate level discourse, and I also don't think that what Ibram X. Kendi is doing is CRT. And I think that there are definitely overreaches with respect to his messaging and the people messaging for people like Robin DiAngelo, which we can get into. But I do just want to button this little part out, which is that the law is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about systemic issues. And CRT is literally something that came out of the legal field. And so I took a corporate law class from, he didn't call himself this, but he probably would have asked a Marxist, which is very rare in the law and economics department and what is traditionally a conservative field. And what he challenged us to do is to interrogate whether the law as it's designed is the best way that it should be designed for social outcomes. Since the law is ours, we are a community and society, and we can decide how we structure our laws. And what you realize as a lawyer is that outcomes in cases have very little to do with legal precedent or the facts of the matter, and everything to do with the personal perspective and bias of a judge. Like it or not, one way or the other, sometimes you like it, sometimes you don't. And here's an example of a story that you're
saying our entire judicial system is a function of bias. There are no rules, there are laws that need to be.
There are some loose guardrails.
Well, you have to have some judgment, some human judgment in the system. But are you saying it's outside of the system altogether, that we live in a essentially rigged?
Let me tell you a story. So one of the stories cases we assessed early, I remember in the first week of school or so, involved, this is like a classic like 19th century case. There's a girl from Ireland who comes across in a boat immigrating. For some reason, she's traveling without her family. Let's say she's like 7 years old. When she gets
familiar. It's an old American story.
It's a tale as old as time, you know. She gets to Ellis Island, and there is a vaccination requirement. Now, all along the journey, there have been
evil totalitarians.
There's signs up before, on the boat, and after that says you must get vaccinated, right? But this is some poor Irish lass. She can't read. She has no way of knowing what any of these signs say, etc. She gets to the place. They said signs say there's some risk of bad reaction to the vaccine, but again, she can't read it. An adult man with a lab coat, like the doctor, comes up and says, either you take the shot or you have to go back a week or however long it takes to get back to Ireland in steerage. She barely understands what this man is saying in his American accent. She submits to the shot. She's one of the people who has a terrible reaction and almost dies. And she files a lawsuit. There's a tort case about whether or not she can sue. I don't remember who it is, the vaccine manufacturer, the immigration facility. I don't remember what it was. And the judge says, no, she assumed the risk. And everybody's like, okay, fine. You learn the case and you go about your business. That's normally what we would do in law school. Okay, I learned the lesson that you assume the risk. The signs were posted. That's all anybody can do. Now, our professor asked us, should we have a legal system? And maybe you can feel different ways about this, but should we have a legal system that believes that a 7-year-old child who cannot read, who is being told by an adult authority figure in an official garb that they have to take the shot or else endure a very arduous journey back home, who doesn't really have decision-making capacity, right? Should we say that the onus is on her and that she assumed the risk? Or should the people who have the most power and the ability to control the situation have to assume some of the risk and maybe provide a translator, maybe make sure she's more properly informed?
What year was this?
18, whatever. But like, should we this is a serious question.
Well, I think it's a rather poor example, if I may say so. But for the following reasons,
sure,
she's not a citizen, so that puts her in a totally different legal category. She is applying to enter the United States, which is, as I might tell you from my own experience, is a very different position than being a citizen of the United States. And I think that's a completely legitimate distinction.
Secondly, let's pretend she is. Her parents have gotten citizenship, and they've sent for her to join, and that's how it's happening.
I tend to think, I'm surprised you don't think it also, that vaccination things are important for public health.
No, but the question isn't whether or not she should be vaccinated.
If she were a citizen, there wouldn't be a test. She could duck it or refuse it, but she wouldn't. She could carry on living her life. So it doesn't work as an example.
I need you to engage with the
I'm trying to engage with it. You gave me specifics, and I'm trying to engage with
here's another example. We all know the famous McDonald's case where the woman spilled coffee on her lap and she sued for a bunch of money and she won this huge judgment, right? Are you familiar with this case?
Yes.
from the 90s, and it was like a laughing stock. It was a joke to most, like, oh, this woman, she was so stupid, she spilled her coffee and then she's trying to milk McDonald's for it. And it was supposed to be an example of overreach and the need for tort reform, which was the big, that was the CRT of the 90s. Tort reform. We need to,
oh, please God, bring it back.
Tort reform.
Torts got out of control. I mean, it was crazy.
Okay, well, when you look at the facts of the case, the reality was that she was not driving irresponsibly in the car with coffee in her lap. She was parked. Her son was driving. She was an elderly woman. She did spill her coffee. God forbid she spilled her coffee, but it didn't just like scald her. She got third the worst, or is first the worst? I always forget.
I don't know.
The worst one. Degree burns all the way down to her pelvic bone. That's how hot it was. It melted her sweatpants to her leg and burned her.
It can't be hotter than the boiling point.
So
right?
This is the question. Why was the coffee so hot? Why was the coffee so hot? So in the litigation, what came out was that McDonald's was hyperheating their coffee because they saved like a cent a cup by keeping it that temperature instead of, whatever, having to reheat it or whatever the mechanism was. I don't remember the technicals of it. And what that woman's judgment actually was that she won was 1 cent off of every, or I think it was like 1 day of McDonald's coffee sales in the country. So her judgment was huge, but ultimately it was just 1 day of McDonald's coffee sales. And also that judgment got reduced in subsequent litigation. And she never saw a fraction of what that initial big number was. So when you get a sense of additional facts, one might ask, should our legal system be structured so that even, should you say if a person spills their coffee on themselves, they assume the risk of third degree burns down to their vagina? Their pelvis bone? Is that what we're saying? Or are we saying maybe we should say that the institution that has the ability to best control the situation and protect our safety should have some responsibility to not just do the bare minimum, put seatbelts in our car, like protect us in some way. Consumers have some kinds of rights.
Well, clearly she did, right? I mean, this legal case suggests that, again, this individual, because of a small risk, was able, because of her individual rights, to sue this massive corporation and win a big damage.
But she ended up losing the vast majority of that settlement because McDonald's and their money. The same with the Stephen Donziger case is happening. You can win a judgment, but at the end of the day, they locked him up for winning the biggest judgment ever against ExxonMobil. Are you familiar with this at all?
I'm trying to stick with the McDonald's lady for the time being.
No, I'm sorry, but it's all part and parcel of the same thing.
Look, this is America, Briahna. I mean, at some point, everybody's not a baby, and you do have to get on with your life.
So is McDonald's
have to take certain risks for yourself.
But this is the question. At what point?
Clearly they were being a bit baby, and they got called on it. And through the system that we have, she got a big settlement.
And that's a success case, although she lost the game of public opinion. But let's look at the stat. She was able to litigate and win. Kind of. Only 8%, I believe, of Americans ever are in a position where they can even afford an attorney. And we know that 8% is not the most marginalized group, and whatever like pro bono attorney took her case, I'm sure that was a unique situation. So we have a legal system that puts the onus on individuals, on consumers. You have to prove causation, right? That's a big issue in all these environmental cases. I got cancer. Everyone in my neighborhood has cancer. There's a polluting plant right there, but people just sometimes get cancer for other reasons. So how can I prove that my cancer and my neighbor's cancer and all of our Erin Brockovich cancers are from that place? And remember, in Erin Brockovich, they were only able to prove it because she got documents from the company that basically admitted it, because it's so hard to prove. So there are all these what I'm just trying to say is there are all these systemic things that are built into the law that could be structured differently, that makes it so that the corporations always win, and it's very difficult for individuals to assert our legal rights, even if occasionally we break through.
Well, that's a strange example to use to make that point, because it makes the opposite point. That's the only thing I would say. And
wait, how so?
Because she succeeded. I mean, everybody made fun of someone whining about spilling some hot coffee, but when you look at the details, what you're saying is true, she had a case and she won it. So system worked.
Do you think
do I think there should be?
You think that's typical?
Do I think there should be people who are public assistant lawyers to help the poor represent themselves in court? Absolutely.
But they're not. There aren't.
People are assigned lawyers if they.
I'm very familiar with, as the watchers of the show know, all I do is date public interest lawyers. That's my wheelhouse.
But I don't have a problem with that. And you're not going to have.
There's not enough. an individual who gets in a car accident or is cut by a faulty piece of machinery, whose blender goes off the fritz, who has oil leakage in their backyard and gets a pernicious disease, they do not have the same ability to afford representation or defend against a corporation if they choose to attack them the way that Steven Donziger does as people who have money and resources. This is our legal system benefits people with money. O.J. Simpson, here, you should like this. Race is a thing. But at the end of the day, it's O.J. Simpson's financial resources that ultimately enabled him to get off. Because money ultimately is king, and our legal system benefits those who have it. And so that's just, I'm only raising that as an example of how it's a system. It's a structure that structurally disadvantages people who don't have money, people who don't have education and access.
The question is simply this. Can we, as we have done progressively, added aspects of entitlements, reform, some programs, et cetera, while keeping the essential system intact, to make more people able to access that system? Or do we want to change the structure entirely so that intent doesn't matter? You don't have to prove causation. You only look at outcomes.
Wait. When you say intent doesn't matter, what are you referring to?
Well, for example, did McDonald, was this entirely accidental? This happened. Did McDonald?
Well, no,
but if it looks like McDonald, but that's the point. You had to prove that intent, and then you got the settlement. If something is totally accidental, but if it has to be, look, I'm not.
Well, what would be accidentally keeping coffee at super high boiling? I mean, I don't even.
It might have been a wonky machine or something. I mean, there are other possible explanations. I didn't know this policy, but I do think the policy is relevant to the case because it points to who's responsible, which means you had to have some intent involved. You were aware of what you were doing. You can't convict people of things they didn't think they were doing. I'm being tripped up because intent has a specific meaning within the law. So I see what you're saying. If it were like one employee was mishandling the machine, it would have limited liability, and that's fine. And the law already provides, believe me, the law is very good at limiting liability. That's why it should be, because otherwise we'd all be completely paralyzed. Look, America is a place where, America of all countries on earth is the place where risk is valued, where failure is integral to the system.
We take risks. Corporations are protected and shielded from all risks. That's the problem. It's socialism for the rich, rugged individualism for the poor. We here are having to scrape it. Look at ExxonMobil. Well, you know how they got out of paying their $9 billion judgment? They say, it's a different company now. They set up a shell company and say, that one's deflected. That was the company that you held the judgment against. We're different.
To make this system work for everybody is not something I'm going to oppose. To curtail abuse of this is not something I'm going to oppose. But
that's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about. We're saying that the system doesn't work because it's set up.
In any free system, there will be inequalities of wealth. Those inequalities of wealth will
always
mean there are more options.
What we're talking about is fixing it so that is not true. What we're talking about
is this: do you fix it by a pragmatic measure, or do you fix it by altering the very context of
what does that mean
itself? Well, it means that you add something protection to the liberal system. You don't dismantle the liberal system entirely, so that outcomes are the only determinants.
We need to get into this because you seem to have, and I don't mean this like derisively, but I'm trying to be descriptive here, a kind of attachment to the status quo, which feels ideological more so than I do. Like I'm not just randomly trying to tear things apart that work. I don't have an ideological commitment one way or the other, but I feel you resisting just conceptually and abstractly the idea of dismantling something that you think is fundamentally good that is here.
I do think it's fundamentally good. I do think the liberal democracy is fundamentally good. I do think a government that is limited in its ability to curtail what it regards as terrible outcomes is a better long-run system than one that empowers a government to do that, because government often makes mistakes, overreaches, can tax people too much. Majorities can. In other words, there's a balance here.
But here's what's going on.
I do think, and this is one reason why you see so much immigration to the United States, is that this is a system people love, and it's also been a system that has created more wealth and more dynamism than any other country on earth. It's a system that has allowed
It certainly has.
Multiracial, multicultural society.
Lots of wealth.
Beyond
Very few.
beyond anything else in history previously. And it succeeds basically pretty well. And you're saying it's intolerable because these few inequalities still exist.
I have not used that word in this conversation.
Well, then let's say that Ibram Kendi thinks it's all intolerable.
But he's not here.
Well,
so is there something that I've said that you object to?
No, okay. I mean, I think we agree, except I think you don't quite fully agree with me that, in fact, either the individual comes first or systems and structures.
I don't know what that means. I'm going to be really honest. I don't know what that debate is. If systems and structures
comes first, the individual.
What is comes first?
The individual has no rights. Right?
What is comes first?
It means that the interest of the race, the interest of the sex, the interest of this group prevails over any individual within that group or any individual. I don't know that I've argued that, and I don't know that anyone's really arguing that. What people are saying is that because people are structurally, legally persecuted on the basis of race or sex, that there are movements to restore those legally stripped rights to those groups so that individuals within those groups can enjoy the individuality that non-persecuted groups have always enjoyed. Are you telling me that members of these oppressed groups have never experienced individuality?
Not to the extent that people who aren't.
Really?
Yeah. Like, why is that?
Do you think life is more complicated than that?
How can it be that you recognize that there are legal prohibitions against basic rights for various groups at various times in America?
Oh, in the past?
I'm going to limit it to the past for the sake of conversation, but yes, in the past.
Sure. But happily, we've managed to work through that.
How can you... I'm going to table that. I want the audience to know that I'm not accepting that, but I'm wanting to move past that for the course of this conversation.
We dramatically altered the contract.
Let's pretend it's 1963 for the sake of argument, even though we don't need to pretend it's 1963. For the sake of argument, let's pretend it's 1963, which, by the way, means my mother was born into a world without civil rights as a human being. Okay. So both my parents. So it's 1963. Because there's legal segregation, there are not just Black people, but many populations are legally unable to contract, as you put it. Now, we could interrogate why it is that our legal rights are bound up in ability to contract, which, given how few people ever have access to the law, is a really bizarre way to structure rights and interests. Why is the law so focused on our ability to contract with each other, which is something that very few people do in any concretized way, but never mind. Of course, a person who is subject to those kinds of legal limitations, and not to mention societal limitations, being told you have to walk off the side of the road when a white person comes by, or you're going to get beaten and thrown into a ditch like Emmett Till. This was the real life. This is not an abstraction. Is not able to be an individual. They have to be a Black person who has to behave in a certain way in the world so as not to be arrested, so as not to be fired without cause, so as not to be aligned. You can't get certain kind of jobs. You can't get a certain kind of education. You can't buy a house. Of course, you can't be an individual if you were defined by the state as something other than a human being. Well, no? We're in agreement?
Strictly speaking, by 1963, there weren't denied being a human being. But yes, there were structural, legal, government, and this is the key distinction for a liberal, government-imposed laws.
And 10 years ago, 5 years, when was Obergefell? A few years ago, when there were no federal marriage rights, were you or were you not limited in your ability to express yourself individually and get married?
Absolutely, I was not limited. I could be whoever I wanted to be, and I was. And so were people under extraordinary situations of oppression. I mean, look at a figure like Oscar Wilde. Look at, again, you are diminishing the ability of human beings under any circumstances.
Andrew, what's happening is you're doing the thing again where you're overreading my argument, and maybe that's my own fault. So let me limit it. Even Emmett Till, who was a child beaten to death, brutalized, and thrown into the ditch, in some aspects of his life, of course, got to be an individual. In his house, I'm sure he played checkers with his mom and tasted her dinner and lived a life as an individual. Everybody always, in the worst circumstances in the world, managed to carve out some interiority, some life for themselves. Of course, that's the case. Well, but the point of the matter is,
around the world, and nor has it always been the case.
Of course, the point is that some people get to live a much more fully individualistic life without limitations than others. And our
because of money, primarily, at this point.
Well, no.
Because they have more money than other people.
Rich gay people couldn't get married any more than poor gay people could get married.
That's true.
Right. So we're not talking about money. I'm a big proponent of focusing on class, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend that these legal prohibitions that so many groups were under were about finances exclusively.
No, but you agree with me, though. You have agreed with me, and this encourages me, that there's an irreducible individuality under whatever circumstances.
Yeah,
and that people, even under the most intense forms of oppressions, are still themselves. And that belief is and that matters massively.
Okay.
And that belief undergirds liberalism. That's what it's really about.
But nobody's arguing that, Andrew.
But I do think they are.
No, no one's arguing that people are people. No, nobody's arguing that people aren't people, that people aren't individuals.
The West has constructed a society in which that individual has irreducible basic rights, and that regardless of their identity.
It hasn't. We don't have irreducible basic. Point, I wish we did.
I think
the United States is one of the only countries that hasn't signed on to like the Universal Declaration of the Child, all kinds of international charters, because we won't guarantee basic rights. A right to health insurance, a right to shelter, a right to food.
These are not liberal constitutional rights.
Well, what are the rights that matter more than a right to food and shelter?
Substantive goals for
is life,
society.
Liberty, and pursuit of happiness not involve ability to eat, and 1 in every 5 American children not being food insecure?
Look, it certainly didn't guarantee the right to eat. People starved in this country. People were dying left and right. They were on the frontier. No, they could get up in the morning, be shot dead that evening.
And this is
America. Well, no, I think it's also a virtue in many ways, because it inculcates a kind of spirit and self-reliance and self-government is absolutely
kids
appealing.
Should be hungry and die so that we can have.
Say what?
Kids should go hungry and be food
of course not.
So what is it exactly that? What is this argument? What are we debating right now?
The argument is whether fundamentally liberal democracy is a successful system based upon individual rights.
I don't think that's
regardless of identity. Now we can make some practice. We can make some, and we have, and we should include as many people in that system as possible. We can even add programs to help people access that system. Like we can create affirmative action. We can spend vast amounts of public money on marginalized minorities. But our job as a society is not to achieve these equal outcomes.
I know you want to be having a conversation about whether liberal democracy is valuable. I promise you I'm not having that conversation. Concede it. I don't care. This abstraction that's never existed, but it's an ideal that we all value is valuable. Okay, great. Liberal democracy is valuable. We should protect it. Now I'm interested in fixing the fucked up world we have right now. Do you know what I mean?
Well, sure. Then show me how, but don't regard the entire system.
Let's talk about
to be junked and started over.
Maybe it will. Maybe it won't have to be. But we're so
no. You can't just say that. You can't just say maybe it will have to be entirely junked.
Wait.
I mean, sorry,
are you not open? Are you not open to the idea that interrogation of our system and putting all the greatest minds in our liberal democracy together, if they think up some ideas that are perhaps better than the handful of men 400 years ago contemplated, that we shouldn't try to move in that direction? You think that that's the zenith of all intellectual thought in the history of man is the Enlightenment era? Like, come on.
Talk about straw men, Briahna.
Okay, so correct me. Tell me what I'm getting wrong.
I studied, for example, a 20th century political philosopher who was interested in the epistemological origins of liberalism. I don't even know quite what you're asking me to say about that.
I would prefer to have a conversation. I would love to concede the point.
That if I looked at world history and I thought, which countries and societies would I rather have lived in? First of all, there's almost no society on earth I'd rather live in today than right here. And I think that's probably true of you too.
I don't know. I was just fantasizing about moving to an island far away from here.
Everybody fantasizes about moving to an island far away from it. But nonetheless, you're here and it's not perfect and it has major flaws, but it is not structurally and systemically cruel and designed to oppress certain groups. There are issues involved in it that need to adjust to the failure of some groups to do as well as other groups, and we can do that. But it's not a reason to junk the entire principles themselves. That is what this ideology is about. It's a successor ideology to liberalism. If you accept any of its essential points, you are unraveling the system as a whole, and that's why it has to be stopped at the bottom up. And that's what's happening out there. People are beginning to hear what their kids are being taught, They see what the elite believes, and they're just saying, we don't like this, we don't want it. And the response of the elite is to say, you're a bunch of white supremacist racists, and you're lying.
Is it
and
a problem?
That's not working. It didn't work yesterday.
Is it a problem, as you indicated earlier in this conversation, that there's been a massive upward transfer of wealth, that the top six wealthiest Americans or whatever it is owns more wealth than the bottom 50%, that these ratios have changed dramatically since the 1960s, where the average CEO earned 30 times their worker, now it's 300 plus times. Do you think that's a problem?
Yes, I do. And I think it's fixable within the system itself.
Okay, but I just have a couple follow-ups, because I'm setting just a little something up. Okay.
You said you have a trap for me? Is that what you're doing?
I wouldn't call it that. It's an uncharitable reading. But do you think it's a problem that, 40% of Americans couldn't respond to a $400 emergency?
You're using this word problem to conflate a whole bunch of things.
Well, do you think that's, do you think that in the richest country in the world that makes sense?
I'd rather not be the case. And
Okay.
I do think some redistribution, the reason I would support that redistribution is precisely because when this liberal system results in that kind of grotesque inequality, it's destabilizing itself.
Okay.
So I would like to redistribute to save the system, as opposed to seeing that redistribution, that inequality as integral to the system that therefore has to be dismantled.
That's completely fine. So the third question is, if basically 40% of the country is on the brink, can't afford a 40%, if 6 people have more wealth than the bottom half of the country, if there's an uninsured health insurance crisis in this country, people are getting sick and walking to the hospital, like dragging themselves like, a legless zombie, is that a systemic problem, or is it the individual behaviors of the 40 to 50% of Americans that are the problem?
Well, it's obviously both, in as much as, there are going to be inequalities, because the truth is that humans are unequal, that some people are better at things than others, and certain things are better at things that actually... People. No, I agree. It's a big, big, big problem. I would happily redistribute some wealth that way.
So there are systemic there's a systemic problem in America.
That's a function of a variety of things that's happened in capitalism in the last 30 to 40 years.
Systemic issues. Just like in the legal system, we have lobbying from all of these. We have the Federalist Society. We have all kinds of legal lobbying that literally change our corporate laws to make them advantageous to corporations over human beings. All of these things are subject to money and power and influence and systemic problems. And it should be constantly subject to reform, because inevitably rich people get corrupt. And what CRT says,
CRT
and what
has nothing to do with this.
is all of these.
Nothing to do
it literally says the whole point of it is to look at these systems that we're all taught are neutral, the neutral hand of the market, the neutral legal system, and to say they aren't in fact neutral, that they are susceptible to manipulation and gaming by elites, and that they have been gamed in that way, and that we should not rely on these kinds of biased systems to free us, as in by relying on the courts to desegregate us, and that's going to solve all of our broader issues. That is literally what CRT is about.
It is not. It is not. If it were about, for example, readjusting economics, it wouldn't need any of its arguments about race as the essential organizing feature of our society. That's what makes it distinctive.
No, it looks at the ways that our legal system disadvantages people on the basis of race.
It doesn't. It argues that a facially neutral system somehow manages nonetheless not to end all inequalities in this way. In fact, it doesn't seem to have had much of an effect that much at all. And that begs the question, obviously, if I'm using that correctly, is that what is doing that? Is it obviously the law?
Well,
or is it
about this
something else?
Of facially neutral.
Because again, what would you do? Rewrite a law so that it favors certain racial groups over others?
Well, why is
that your contention?
I would certainly rewrite the law so it doesn't favor corporations.
Well, that again is not. Again, let's not get CRT muddled up with old school leftism, which is just make sure corporations are not given. Look, every real capitalist believes, from Adam Smith onwards, that big corporations should be kept under control. Every free market capitalist worth his or her salt wants the government to be in there, breaking up monopolies, enforcing antitrust laws, making sure that the markets are fair and accessible. Yes, capitalism can be corrupted. It doesn't mean capitalism itself is the problem. In fact, it is not the problem. It is at some deep level a solution to the problem, because those $400, you have to create this wealth in order to redistribute it.
And I would argue that I am much more open to a socialist framework, obviously, than you. But I also think that the argument that socialists are making is not to be anti-competitive or anti-markets. The argument is that that these industries be worker-owned, and so that the benefits can more directly accrue to the people who are doing the work instead of a small cohort at the top. And an emphasis on paying worker salaries, keeping jobs in the country, et cetera, instead of paying dividends to shareholders who don't have the same kind of investment or financial incentives to work for the betterment of the company as a whole, as opposed to like mergers and acquisitions, selling things off, sending things overseas, taking advantage of more advantageous labor markets, et cetera. One last question I just want to ask you to put a button on this, because I think this has been really productive, and I really appreciate your patience in working through this. I know it can be a little tedious, but I think that the devil is in the details.
I enjoy, and believe it or not, I kind of enjoy this.
Good. I'm so glad. Look, this idea of facial neutrality, are you wholly opposed to the idea that, let's even take it away from the legal abstraction, the idea that something can, through no ill intent, disadvantage some people more than others? Is that, what is your response to that idea?
It's welcome to reality.
Okay, so like there's stairs, and if I am in a wheelchair, obviously I can't climb the stairs. No one's trying to hurt anybody with these stairs, but like that's the reality, right?
That's why we have the ADA, when we figured out we needed to make that better.
Okay.
We didn't decide to abolish all stairs.
But there are people, and I had a conservative mentor in my life in a legal context who hated the ADA. And part of the reason was that there's what's called statutory damages for an ADA violation. So the laws came into effect, they had like 10, 20 years or something to come into conformity. But in a city like New York, like there's not going to be ramps everywhere. You know how it goes. So there are people who basically, a lawyer will team up with like a person in a wheelchair and go around the city and find people who have violated the ADA, who aren't up to date. And all they have to do is file a case. And basically, because there's statutory damages, they don't have to prove damages. They get like $500 a pop just by showing that there's an ADA violation. And there's like, the lawyer gets their legal fees, the person in the wheelchair gets a cut, and it is what it is. And so my conservative mentor, hated this, because we're gaming the system. My argument to him was, okay, but maybe they should just be in compliance. And there are arguments to be had there, and whether or not that's the best way to
business that really has very little leeway.
And maybe the government should help. If we as a society value accessibility,
that would be a critique of the ADA, where you want the government to give some tax rebates or something for doing it.
And I would support that.
I wouldn't be opposed to it either. It's not that important.
But
it's not that.
Yeah, but that's all just to say that I think that sometimes the idea of facial neutrality and then trying to create, I know this is a word people don't like, equity as opposed to just basic equality. What that means is, it's not about having the same outcomes, but it is acknowledging that because of my own personal moral ethics, I want the person in the wheelchair to be able to go to the same restaurant that I'm going to go to. And deciding as a society that I want it to be as easy for them to access something as me. Maybe they can't afford to eat there still. Maybe they don't like Szechuan food. I don't know. I can't explain all of those things away. And I'm not trying to create the same outcomes. But I would encourage folks not to be quite so hostile to the idea that sometimes there are inequities that can be entrenched and cemented because we decided to do equality after so many groups were so disadvantaged. So if suddenly you can have access to a house, but I have no means because I haven't been able to grow a home equity over the last 100 years, it doesn't matter if I can technically move into that neighborhood because it's not technically legally prohibited, which is why we have segregation at the exact same levels now. Housing segregation is the same as it was 50 years ago.
Well, it's
and school education is
again, here you're
the same.
Blurring the word segregation from legally imposed.
No, it's de jure. It's not de jure. It's de facto.
De facto. Well, there's a distinct.
Yeah, it's de facto.
Do you accept that liberalism, the freedom and equality and opportunities that it gives, there's obviously a trade-off here. My view is that compared to what? Do you want the government designating certain racial groups to be given extra privileges in the law? How do you get that passed? It's against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to formally support some groups over others on the basis of race or gender or identity, all the rest.
No one's getting special treatment.
Do you want to do that?
The Supreme Court has been very clear that door is not open.
Well, but you would open that door, which is...
When did I say that?
Oh, I don't know.
What am I arguing exactly? Go on, Andrew. There's a realm of enough actual disagreement for us not to have to
Okay. I think if
stuff.
someone works for the same test and the test has been shown to be an adequate and accurate assessment of one's ability to succeed
it's a lot of ifs already.
Well, I think that the evidence for that is pretty overwhelming. Then I don't think then you do better than someone else. I don't think you should be prevented from going to school because you're the wrong race.
I don't know. I did pretty well on my SATs, and my freshman year grades are pretty piss poor. But that's neither here nor there. This could open a whole other door to another fascinating conversation that I'd love to have from you. But I'm seeing that we're getting the cane. So we got to wrap this up. Today. I really do appreciate. I know that you've had a long day, and this was not an easy conversation. And I appreciate you sticking it out. And I appreciate you keeping your door open on your podcast to having conversations with people who are ideologically opposed. I don't think it does anybody any good to be siloed. And I really am. I know that some people are going to feel some sort of way about this, but I think there's value in this and figuring out exactly how far apart we are and what we're actually saying versus what we think we're saying. And I think there's real opportunities for growth here and understanding.
There's an advantage into figuring out precisely what you disagree about.
Yeah.
As well as the things that you agree about. And you're not going to be able to get to that if you don't actually have a conversation.
Yeah.
But the other thing we're doing is that we are assuming good faith on each other's part.
Yes.
And that's also what's collapsed. That people don't trust the faith of their opponents. That's a breakdown in this, again, a liberal culture in which we, even though humans are bad, there's lots of badness in humans, but when we go into debate, we're saying we're not going to involve the character of this person or the background. We're just going to deal with the subjects we're going to debate, and we're going to figure out who's right and wrong and to what extent. And I think and this is a broad word, liberal, but that is free. Doing that is what makes a democracy possible, which is why we're in a dangerous position.
I do agree with that.
Where no one's talking to each other.
I do agree with that, which is why we have this aptly titled podcast, Bad Faith. Ironically titled, even though the internet can't quite get past the irony there. People should also go and listen to what I think of as the part one of this conversation over on Sully Dish, where we get into some of the more policy particulars of how to create the world that I'd like to see. And I think there was a lot of space for agreement there as well. It was a really productive conversation.
In many ways. Yeah.
Well, thank you again. And to our audience, as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.